Welcome to Awakening Birth, the podcast for mothers, babies, and the people who care for them. In each episode, we will share information, stories, tips, answer your questions, and awaken your own inner knowing about your pregnancy, childbirth, and those first months after baby is born. Now, here are your hosts, Robin Lim and Deborah Flowers.
Happy International Day of the Midwife. I'm Robin Lim.
And I'm Deborah Flowers.
And we're here in Bali and we're talking to you about awakening birth. Today we're going to explore the safety of home birth.
You know, recently I've read quite a few articles that confirm that home birth is safe, yet there are also some articles that come out from time to time that refute the idea. So we thought this would be a good subject for us to address.
Mm-hmm. We should probably make it clear up front that I had all of my children at home and all of my grandchildren were born at home, received by myself and the Bumi Sehat midwives.
And the same for me. I chose home birth for myself because that's where I felt safe. And then I was very happy that my daughter and my daughter-in-law also chose home birth and that I got to be their midwives.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
I feel like I wouldn't do something like that if I didn't feel safe myself and feel safe for my daughter-in-law and grandchildren.
Mm-hmm. And Deborah, you're a midwife as well as a nurse.
That's right.
So in terms of the medical evidence, I think both of us have been very vigilant in reading everything we can, in studying all we can, in having access to the medical libraries, and really looking at the facts. I don't think that either of us would risk the lives of any baby.
Right.
All babies are precious. If it was really unsafe to have babies at home, then why does the British National Health Service say that almost half, actually 45% of their mothers could be giving birth at home, and they're pushing in that direction, and their rationale for saying that babies can be and should be born at home in England, and this is the government, their rationale is simply that moms and babies will be safer. So there you go. I'm with the British.
In the Netherlands, 1/3 of babies are born at home with midwives.
Mm-hmm. And the Netherlands, and along with the other Scandinavian nations, have a much lower maternal and infant mortality rate than other countries. We should point out that ACOG, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, is coping with a very sad statistic right now, and that is that the United States is now number 60 for maternal mortality, which means that of all the so-called civilized countries or allegedly developed countries, there's some argument about what that means, but of the wealthiest countries of the world, the United States spends more on childbirth technology, has more OBGYNs per mother, and yet the United States has, of those countries, those modernized countries, has the highest maternal mortality rate and infant mortality rate that's really, considering the numbers of neonatologists and the most NIC units in the world, we still have such a high infant mortality rate. So I would say that mothers in the United States are actually looking at that and saying, wow, why should I go to a hospital and trust care providers who actually are not showing great statistics? And because they aren't showing great statistics, I think there's this outrage against midwives, because clearly the MANA statistics, the Midwives Alliance of North America project, which the one that's currently online is a study of 16,924 births, showing better outcomes for midwife to mother care. So for me, I'm going to look at the evidence and I'm going to weigh that. And I feel like we also need to look at the human rights issues, because when mothers feel like their bodies are not their own, their babies are not their own, their families are not included, their culture is not respected in a given hospital setting, then they are going to look for home birth, and that's why we know home birth is here to stay, and certified professional midwives are here to stay. And they're very qualified and very professional. And our goal is licensure for certified professional midwives in every state, in all 50 states of the United States. It's a no-brainer, to use what my kids would say, if you look at the facts and not look at the emotions. I want women who feel safer in the hospital to have the same respectful care that women are getting at home. And so this is where we come in as mothers and grandmothers, where we need to say, okay, for example, if my daughter-in-law or one of my daughters said to me, I would like to give birth in the hospital, Mom, can you support me in that? I would say absolutely. There you go.
Well, I feel like women need to give birth where they feel the safest and most comfortable. And for some women, that is in a hospital, and for some women, that's at home. And for that matter, a lot of the women that we take care of at home they tell me that. They'll say, I really wasn't that afraid during my labor, but if I had been in the hospital, I would have been very scared. Mm-hmm. And part of that is the feeling that their body doesn't belong to them anymore when they're in the hospital, that once they walk through those doors, that the doctors are going to make all the decisions and not listen to their desires. And some of that is the doctors feeling like, I went to school and I studied this, so I'm the expert. But women have an inner knowing, they have intuition, and sometimes they will sense something or know that something's going on with their baby or their body before there's clinical signs. So listening to the mothers is an important part of giving good care. And I do believe that women have rights to birth where and how they want to. That basically birth is not an illness. And most of the time we don't need to treat it as an illness.
That's right. That
very skilled midwives can determine when there's a risk factor, when there's a problem, and that's when we want to go to hospitals and consult with doctors and get their help, because all of the things that have been developed that hospitals can do, and that includes epidurals and C-sections, are wonderful life-saving things when they're needed. But when birth starts in a hospital and continues in the hospital, often those things get used more often than is necessary. And that does not make birth safer. Right. The overuse of that technology.
Right. I feel like the issue here, when one former doctor comes out with a New York Times article and says home birth is not safe, and because she was a doctor, people trust her, and because the New York Times published her, that to me feels like irresponsible reporting, because the fact is we're looking at human rights in childbirth. Women must have their choices. They must be free to, with their health providers, in partnership, evaluate their pregnancies and say, wow, I'm low risk. My OBGYN and my midwife say that I can give birth wherever I choose. I can choose home, or I can choose hospital, or I can choose childbirth center. And that is a human right. And the human right is that no matter where a woman chooses to give birth, she should have access to a skilled childbirth provider.
That's right.
If we make these assumptions that things aren't safe, even though women are choosing them, if we do that kind of thing and we start to make a little war, say OBGYNs against midwives and midwives against doulas and hospitals against everybody, if we do that, then there will be victims, and the victims will be mothers and babies, and you see that in America already in the high maternal and infant mortality rate. In countries where midwives and doctors and doulas cooperate and work beautifully together, you're seeing better outcomes.
That's right. That's right. And, I think that's the ideal working conditions for midwives, whether they're working in a home setting or a hospital setting, is to have good backup doctors that they're friends with, where there's trust between the midwife and the doctor. There's no reason why, if a woman can study and become a doctor and be trusted, that a woman can't study and become a midwife and be trusted. But for some reason, there's this tendency that when the word midwife is put in front of somebody's name, then they think, okay, this is somebody who's not well trained. And we're really trying to change that opinion. That's one of the goals that MANA, the Midwives Alliance of North America, has been working on by developing a very strong test for midwives who used to be called direct entry midwives, but now are certified professional midwives.
Absolutely.
One of the reasons that the certification was created was so that the pregnant woman and her family would have a way of knowing that this midwife has a core base of knowledge that's necessary to practice safely.
So I read an interesting response to the New York Times article, and it was from Katrina Kilroy. She's the president-elect of the Canadian Midwives Association, and she says that that the article in question used the Canadian midwifery as an example of good practice, but there's irony in that, because if you really look at Canadian midwifery, it is, according to Katrina and according to all the Canadian midwives that I've spoken to, and they are excellent, it is a direct entry system. So, for example, Canadian midwives may go to school, of course they do, and of course they have practicum. The Canadian schools of midwifery have very close association with the hospitals, so they're preceptored very tightly. And then, once a Canadian midwife starts work, if she decides to go into a hospital-based midwifery practice rather than a home birth, and she can choose to be a home birth midwife, even the hospital-based midwives in Canada, they have been required to have at least one home birth a year under their belt, which just goes to show you that the Canadian Midwives Association and the medical system there considers home birth such an important skill. And in order for the midwives to keep their heart and to keep their soul. So I'm so proud of them. I had an incredible visit here at Bumi Sehat in Bali with Bridget Lynch when she was the president of the International Confederation of Midwives. And she walked into Bumi Sehat and she started crying. And she said this is what she would like to see happening, whereas she'd just been to a meeting in India of the reproductive health so-called experts of the world. And she told me, to be honest, they are pushing birth in every country, in every setting, in every culture into more and more technologically equipped hospitals. They want to corral birth because actually those people believe that they're doing the safest thing for mothers and babies, whereas mothers are saying no, we want that woman-to-woman care, we want the midwife-to-mother model. Yes. We don't feel safe in the hospitals. And then you can say, well, okay, there's home birth, there's hospital birth, and then there's that midwife-to-mother care kind of in-between place called a birth center, which it's very difficult for birth centers to survive in the United States of America. I'd like to see more of that happening so women have a third choice. But the midwives that I know who have opened birth centers and seen them close and given their lifeblood, and then only to have them closed by some technicality. For example, in Iowa, there was a beautiful birth center that the state came in and said the doors aren't wide enough. But in order to change the wideness of the doors, and they're talking about every door in the entire building, in order to change the width of those doors, it would take so much money that it actually bankrupted the childbirth center. We have to look at the history also of how the obstetricians and gynecologists, how the American Medical Association formed, and how they actually eliminated midwifery from the United States of America to the point where almost no babies at all got born into the hands of midwives. But that was a business consideration. And midwives were called witches. Anybody who did any herbal healing or natural healing, they were persecuted. And it's safe to say, if you look at the history of so-called modern medicine, it is a history that's just over 200 years old. And in that 200 years, they've made themselves the experts. And let's face it, they did burn witches. And when they burnt those witches, they destroyed a culture of midwife-to-mother care that had been going on for millenniums.
One of the articles that I read recently about the safety of home birth talked about it was safe as long as it wasn't the first birth. That to deliver babies at home after the first birth was perfectly safe. However, all over the world, people are going towards technology. Oftentimes, they look to the West to see what we're doing in the United States and then copy those practices. Whenever I attend the birth of a mother having her first baby and she successfully delivers vaginally, I feel a special sense of accomplishment because I know that now she can go on and have a history of vaginal births from that point on, as many babies as she wants. When women have their first baby and it becomes a C-section, then the next birth is very likely to be a C-section as well.
We do need to prevent that initial cesarean for the first-time mother. So when we take first-time mothers and tell them that they can only give birth in the hospital, and then statistically their chances of having a cesarean are much higher than if they plan to home birth, this is something that we really have to look at. It's a tragic thing. Sister Morningstar, who's a Cherokee midwife living in the United States, she says something so profound when she said, normal birth includes so many things in the history of our womanhood. And she said, for example, before there were hospitals and before there were rules about who could give birth where and what the limits of protocol were, she said, traditional birth attendants and midwives, they did twin birth, they did breech birth, and they did them safely for the most part. And they never did vaginal birth after cesarean because there were no cesareans or almost no cesareans. Now suddenly midwives are doing vaginal birth after cesarean all the time. And VBAC is safe, in my opinion, under really great conditions with skilled birth attendants, but VBAC is not normal. And it's interesting because we keep saying as midwives, we're the guardians of normal childbirth. And yet we're being forced to do something for women which they deserve and which we found is safe, namely VBACs, vaginal birth after cesarean, even though it's not normal. It's not normal because it's an aberration. It was created by the procedures and protocols and presence of the hospitals and the OBGYNs that work there. And again, I want to point out that it's a miracle. When you need a cesarean birth is a miracle. But we have far too many first-time moms being ushered into cesarean birth because of a downward spiral of interventions that end up having her in the hospital and having her doing something she doesn't want to do, which is a cesarean.
Well, in 1965, the C-section rate was 4% in the United States. And it has climbed. A lot of hospitals have between a 30 and 40% C-section rate. Now there is, the doctors are being encouraged to try to reduce that number. At the farm where I've been practicing for the last 35 years, our C-section rate is 1.7%.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah. And of course, those are some of the women that we're transporting. We have 95% of the women who start out with us in labor stay with us and deliver vaginally at the farm. And we have about a 5% transport rate. So 1.7% of those are the ones that have the C-section.
Mm-hmm. And when the farm midwives transport, how is the reception at the hospital?
Very good. And that's one of the ways that I feel fortunate, partly working in Tennessee, that Tennessee has always been friendly to us. The local doctors and hospitals know that when we bring somebody to them, that our clientele would really rather have a vaginal birth, and I feel like they try very hard to make that happen. They treat our women well when we're there. The midwives are allowed to stay. We stay until the baby's born and a little while beyond. So there's continuity of care for the mothers. I think this helps the mothers not feel like a failure because they had to go to the hospital and maybe had to have a cesarean, that they were involved in the decision making that brought them to that point. They know how hard they tried in early labor and that there were good reasons for that transport to happen. I think there's less postpartum depression in the women who have a support person that stays with them from the beginning to, throughout, and sees their labor all the way to the end and welcomes that new baby and rejoices, with the family that this new baby is here and here safely.
Yes. So in a cooperative system where the medical professionals that begin with the mother at home and hopefully follow her through to a home birth and postpartum and a healthy parenting, but if there is a breach in that system, meaning that the baby really needs to go in or the mother needs to go in for the safety of the mother and baby, then there's a system of transport that's functional and works and cooperative. That's the safest option. Getting back to the question of our podcast, is home birth safe?
I think when you take good care of yourself, you eat well and exercise and listen to the advice of your midwife.
And you choose skilled midwives who resonate with you and who have good backup. Is home birth safe?
Absolutely.
I'm Ibu Robin Lim.
And I'm Deborah Flowers with Awakening Birth.